Okay, so let's start with ranges. Obviously, we're going to start with Under the Gun. Most of these games in Chinese apps do have 8-handed tables, but it doesn't matter. Like, even if you would play 9-handed, you can simply use Under the Gun range. It doesn't change basically. Yeah, even two Under the Gun positions are very similar, so either you add or remove one hand definitely do not have big effect on your whole play and the strategy. So, as I said, we're going to start by opening ranges and how to defend those ranges facing free bets, so that you have a pretty good understanding how the overall strategy looks and how you should be playing. Then we're going to move how you should be playing when you're already facing a raise, how you should be defending from all of the blinds and what adjustments you should making and so on. So basically we're going to cover probably most of what you need to know in the pre-flop strategy section, and we're going to start by doing that with under the gun ranges. So this is pretty easy to understand. Yeah, we're just going to open all the red hands, and when you have better table, you can start adding few more hands in your opening range. So I marked this in this color. What I mean by good table is that maybe you do not have extremely loose opponents behind you who are going to be free betting a lot. So if you are going to see flop more often, it obviously means you can open more hands and realize your equity easier, right? So this is a deal. Same goes about the big blind. In this game, it's going to be the straddle. So if you have a weaker player in that spot, you definitely can add few more hands in your opening range as well and take advantage of your edge post flop. So this is pretty easy, right? When you are under the gun +1, you can add few more hands. As you see, you have an option of opening ace 10 off and king jack off additionally to previously one, and that's the biggest change because it definitely adds quite a few combos. So you should not be going too crazy because you still have a ton of opponents left behind you, and this is just going to be simple and solid strategy. So now when you open those hands, we're going to see how you should be playing facing a free bet, right? So against this range, when you open under the gun, specifically these hands, and face a free bet from the next player who's going to be under the gun +1, you should not be going too crazy as well. You should be folding weakest part of your range, but you still end up defending enough. So hands that I'm going to 4-bet just going to be aces kings and ace king suited, and ace 5 obviously we're going to use as a bluff. But you could be surprised that we are calling quite a lot against this really strong range, but this is something you should actually be doing because it is very important for you to understand that you're already getting a really good odds, unless your opponent is like free betting to some ridiculous amount, which obviously something you need to adjust. Like, you always need to adjust to what your opponent is doing. So if he's free betting you 5x, then definitely not defend these hands. But that is not going to happen most of the time. And if he's simply free betting to 3x, which is a standard thing I would say in these games, you can really comfortably defend a lot of these playable hands because you have ridiculously good odds because of all the antis in the pot. And that makes your life pretty easy because you do not need and you do not have to be overfolding obviously, and can be playing a solid range as well. So these things obviously change a little bit as you face a free bet from from later position, right? So if you face a free bet from hijack, you now can add queens to your valor range, hand ace queen, use as a bluff because of its great blockers, and still can get some valor as well. When you face a free bet from cutoff, you can even add jacks to the valor hands. As you see, your calling range doesn't change much. You just start calling other pocket pairs as well, and that is it. When you face a free bet from the button, obviously again you really need to take a look at that specific player, but in most cases button is going to be free betting more wide than earlier positions, so you can add few more bluffs. So hands that are not just good enough to call makes a perfect 4-bets like ace 9 suited, king 9 suited, which plays very good because of the blockers, and it even gives you a ability to flop some very strong hands and draws and makes your life very easy If you face a 5-bet shove, you just get rid of that. If you're not, then you have an easy spot to play post flop, because you will know when to c-bet, when to give up, and so on. And in the first place, you need to take a notice that your overall range is pretty strong, so there is simply no counter strategy to this, and your opponents can't do much. So these are the small changes, going from position to position, but the most important thing is obviously comes when you face a free bet from any of the blinds. Well, it doesn't matter which blind specifically free bets you much, but the biggest difference here is that you can start flatting more hands, and even hands like jacks, which definitely is a good 4-bet for a while, or let's say versus a button, becomes a pretty easy flat. Even queens is questionable and definitely depends on your opponent. But yeah, you need to flat a lot of hands because you can realize your equity much easier when you are in position, and that's going to be the biggest benefit. I would still use some ace-x, low ace-x suited hands as a 4-bet bluffs. You need to have 4-bet bluffs as well to balance your ranges a little bit. So in general, 4-bet works pretty good in these games to my experience, but you need to pick your spots carefully. I would never be for betting these ranges against like fishes. I mean, I would not be for bet bluffing fishes much, not like never, but obviously depends on what kind of recreational player he is, what kind of stats he has, and so on. But versus regulars, these are the ranges you should be playing, and versus weaker players, we definitely need to make some adjustments. But yeah, we will talk about the adjustments a little bit later on. Just in general, you need to understand what is a good and balanced range looks like this, like all of these ranges, and then you can take and play with this range until you notice that your opponents are playing differently from optimal strategy, right? And then you can adjust, you can and should adjust these ranges to counter their strategy. So obviously, if they're free betting like extremely tight, it doesn't matter where which position you are from and where position they're from, but if you have a very tight free better, you obviously should be folding more hands, for betting less bluffs, and even folding some of your weakest part of your calling range. That's a pretty straightforward adjustment. However, if your opponent is very free bet happy, then yeah, you should be making few more 4-bet bluffs, you should be floating good playable hands, and that's pretty straightforward, right? So this is just a common sense that you need to use to adjust to the games that you're playing, to your opponents, and so on. So always keep that in mind. Always think how you can optimize your ranges, your win rates, your EV, and that's going to be yielding you a very good results. So under the gun strategy is pretty straightforward, obviously like most others as well. When we move forward, we're going to counter our hijack, as you see, definitely opening more hands. Well, again, this is just a common sense, and if you have good conditions, you can be opening all the pairs, even hand like queen jack off, which works pretty good. So now what you're doing when you're facing a free bet, again, you simply fold the weakest part that are not going to be played very well. Obviously your 4-bet range changes a little bit. Now you're going to 4-bet these hands with good blockers as well, and jacks in your Waller range. So I believe I do not need to be explaining every single hand why we're doing what. Is pretty straightforward. Cutoff is going to play more hands against hijack open compared to under the gun open. So it means his range is going to be weaker and wider, therefore you can be and should be defending more hands as a 4-bet, because he's going to be folding more, so you just have to pick good ones with blockers. Again, if your opponent free bets a lot and folds a lot to 4-bet, well, pretty easy and straightforward adjustment would be to add some of these hands. One thing that you really need to be careful though is adding offsuit hands as bluffs, because this has like 3 times more combos than suited ones. So obviously it's pretty straightforward because there is 12 combos of each of king queen off, and only 4 combos of the suited hand. So if you add 3 of these hands, is the same outcome as you adding 1 offsuit hand. So be careful. What I want to say here is do not add too many offsuit hands as a bluff, because that way your range could be extremely bluff happy, and that is not very good. So few adjustments about the button play. Again, same logic. You definitely need to widen your Waller range. added here jack stands, and should be adding few more 4 bets. So it's pretty straightforward. You just widen your range because your opponents range is wide as well. So actually I did all the pre-work, and like it took me like more than 20 hours to fine-tune all of these ranges, so I would not need to do this live and waste your time. So now you can just easily see it. You will be able to download all these pictures of all of these ranges as well, so you have it by hand even when playing, and can always check that and know what to do. So that's a benefit as well. Again, versus the blinds, you really want to be calling a ton because you are in position, and you really want to be for betting a bunch as well. Again, opponents who are folding a lot or free betting a lot, just simply add those hands as well as bluffs, because of the blockers, and that's going to perfectly work. Then from the cutoff, now you start opening more, like 25% of the hands, which is reasonable and calculated by a ton of the solvers work. So this is good. One thing here is that you really need to understand the relative strengths of the hand as well. So even though hand like king 6 and king 5 suited are pretty good to open, but it plays very bad if your opponents are very loose and not willing to fold. So if you're playing on a loose game, which is very likely to happen in these straddle games, because in general it makes games looser, then it's not a good idea to open these weak hands if your opponent's flatting. Let's say you open on the cutoff, button flats, small blind folds, big blind flats, straddle flats, and then you're in a 4-way pot with king 5, which is not going to be a good outcome in most cases. So you obviously need to adjust that when you notice how your opponents are playing, but again, it's pretty straightforward thing. But these ranges who are covered in red should be basically opened against every single opponent, unless you have like extremely maniacs after use, and you can tighten this a little bit, but that is more an exception than a rule, I would say. Then if you face again a free bet from the button, again you just widen your valor range, you make some good hands in your calling range that can play good post flop, add some bluffs, pretty straightforward. Against the blinds, more of these hands that you are very happy to 4-bet versus a button now go simply in your calling range. You really want to make your calling range pretty strong so that your opponent would not be able to barrel you off easily. And if this is how your calling range going to look, then no one will be able to barrel you off easily. You will be able to play no matter which run out comes out, and that is the most important fact for sure. So that being said, we're moving to the last position and most profitable one, the button. Now here starts, I would say, the real change here. The important part here is that you have 3 players left, not 2 like in normal games. So you cannot be stealing 70% or something like that. Obviously, you cannot be stealing against 2 blinds this amount of hands in most cases, but it's even more so in straddle games where you have 3 blinds already. So yeah, you need to tighten your range, even though big blind is going to be extremely profitable position, but you need to take it cautiously and play it as it showed here. So again, if your opponents are not very free bet happy, you can start adding more hands. If they are extremely passive, you can add even more. But as a general rule of thumb, you should not be opening way more than 40%. With these hands combined, it comes to 47, and it's a lot. Again, you need specific situation to be opening more. And when you do face a free bet, again, range that you should be defending, I definitely like to add this range in a 4-bet, these hands in a 4-bet range. Queen Jack off as well is pretty good 4-bet, has some blockers, not plays extremely well when called, because people probably not going to be free betting many hands that you dominate with these holdings, so I would much rather use this as a 4-bet bluff. And again, I think this works perfectly. So all of the imposition spots are finished, and now we start from the small blind. Well, small blind is definitely the most important, well, not important, but I'd say the most difficult spot to play, because right now you have two two opponents left, and both of those going to be in position against you after the after the flop. Sorry. So that's going to give you some trouble if you play too many hands. Obviously, this makes sense for you to play tighter than the button, because button is going to be in position, so definitely should be opening less hands. As a general rule of thumb, I do think that you should be playing this range extremely mixed. Like, even the solver suggests that you should be playing these hands by mixing. You should be limping aces, kings, queens, jacks, and so on some of the time. You should be limping Broadway some of the time. You should be raising your weaker part of the range some of the time. And there is just a ridiculous answer. This is the hands you should be playing, and some of the time you should be raising with all of them, some of the time you should be limping with all of them. To make your life easier, I would just use exploitative strategy and raise my strongest part and limp some of the still playable hands. But if you will do exactly that every single time, you will be doing pretty bad against very good and strong opponents. So if you're playing against regulars, then right, you need to start to be defending these hands even more by calling, and I mean the stronger hands as well. Actually, I'm going to pause this video for a second and bring you the solver range as well. Here it is. So probably this is going to make you easier to understand what I mean by saying you should be limping all of these hands and raising all of these hands. So this is a solved range, which gives you optimal play against anyone, right? But this is not exactly very easy to implement. So again, if you're playing against weaker players, then just raising the biggest part of your hands and limping some weaker hands is fine. But if you're playing against good opponents, if you have straddle and big blind reasonably good players, then this is something that you just have to do, and you have to start limping all your good hands some of the time. Otherwise, every time you limp, you're going to be raised, and every time you're going to be raised, you're going to be folding almost always. So that sucks and not something you should be doing. So if you use that exploitative strategy here and face a raise, then again, pretty straightforward how to play it. You're just going to call some playable hands, 4-bet, while apart, and some bluffs, and that is it. Though if you decide to limp, as you should be doing based on the solver situation, I do think that you need to understand that you need to have a limp raising range as well, and you need to include some bluffs in that, which is something that people very rarely do. So this is a must, because again, otherwise you're going to get exploited by good players, and if you're not playing by good players against a good players in the straddle and the big blind, then you probably should not be limping too much and can be stealing a ton. Unless your opponent is extremely passive, then again, you can be doing this strategy and simply printing money, because you're limping the hands that are not extremely good. But if your opponents are passive, they're going to check behind a lot, and you're going to see the flop, which is the most important part by limping these weaker hands. And because there is already a lot of dead money, you're going to realize your equity way more than enough for those hands to make it profitable and make it better than folding, and that is obviously your goal. So if you decide to limp of these hands and you face a raise, then you definitely should be raising your wilder part of the hands, and definitely should be raising some bluffs. It's pretty straightforward, right? Think about yourself. When you're in the straddle, let's say small blind calls but big blind folds, you're going to isolate that with a ton of shitty hands. So if you face a raise, you're going to end up folding a lot, and it is extremely tough to play, because you are not going to be able to break down your opponent's range very precisely in that spot, and that is the reason why your opponent is not going to be able to do that as well. So your goal is to put your opponent in tough spots, and that is a very good way to do that. So yeah, stick to the strategy and you'll be doing very good, and you will not have much problems playing this from the hardest position that there is in these games. Now from the big blind, look at this. This is going to make you happy, right? This again, the strategy that solvers gives is to limp 100% of your range with very small percent of raising, and by small percent I have in mind like 1 out of 5 times you should be raising aces, kings, and queens, something like that. But in reality, this is not something I'm actually playing. But yeah, all the solvers suggest that this is a very good strategy, and it makes sense obviously, because your opponent is not going to have a very easy time exploiting you if you're going to have all the top part of your range. Now, if you use exploitative strategy and raise like this and limp only weaker hands, then again good opponent can exploit you. If that is going to happen, well, in most cases not. But you need to understand the difference. Against tough and good players, you simply can't be raising top part of your range and limping weakest hands. It's not going to work. Against weaker players, this is the best strategy. Against weak players trying to balance your ranges, you play like solver suggests, kind of GTO way, is simply leaving money at the table. If you're leaving money at the table, you're not going to win as much as you should, and obviously winning as much as you should is your main concern. So you need to distinguish these spots, same from the small blind, same from the big blind. Sometimes you just can end up limping all your range because you already have so much dead money. You really literally have eight players antis, right? You have small blind who already folded in this spot. You have half of the straddle already posted and the straddle, so you only need half of the straddle to get a chance to get an equity from all of these chips, and that's what you're doing pretty good by limping all your hands. Again, if you limp and straddle raise, this is your strategy. Again, you are limp raising some of your part of your strong range and calling a bunch of playable hands, I would say. In the meanwhile, you could mix some aces and kings in your calling range. That is not extremely necessary, but if you want to protect your range even more, you can do that for sure. So we talked about this. This is actually the strategy I would take and use out of the box. But again, if your straddle is good top reg, then maybe limping everything is going to be better for you. But if that is not the case, then this strategy is simply going to end up making you more money, which is obviously pretty good. And if you're opening these hands and then and then face a free bet, again, you're going to have pretty easy life by playing these hands, by calling all of these medium and 4-betting wall range and some bluffs. So pretty straightforward, right? So the biggest takeaway from here, I would say, is that you really need to have a fixed strategy that you're going to play against the regs, and then exploitative strategies that you're going to use against recreation players, and this is exactly what we covered here. So if you distinguish who are regulars in your games and who are recreational players and use different strategies against them, then you're going to simply put yourself in extremely good spot post-flop, because you're going to choose different hand ranges to play against one group and against another, and you can very easily manipulate that by forcing them to make a ton of mistakes post-flop, and again build your win rate this way, which is probably the best thing you could do for yourself, because if you play pre-flop right, then post-flop game becomes so much easier for you, because if you're leaving a lot of mistakes pre-flop and not realizing your full potential, then post-flop kind of becomes a disaster as well, because you already made mistakes and it's pretty hard to fix them later on later streets. So definitely think these ranges through, do not rush it, take your time, definitely try and understand, like, it's not important to memorize either king 5 should be folded or not, opened or not, is king 6 is mandatory for bet or you can fold it. No, it's not important. Important thing is the hand groups that you're going to play one way or another, distinguish the differences, and then adjust your strategy accordingly. So this is it about how you should be playing when everyone folds until you have an option to open, and when you open, how you should be defending versus free bets. This is definitely a very important part, which you obviously want to know, and later on in the next video going to be talking about how you should be playing when you are facing a raise already, and what hands you need to free bet, what hands you need to call and float, and so on. So yeah, we're going to talk about that soon.